Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to talk about whether or not you should get fishing ships. Of course, on water maps, they're incredibly important, as deep-sea fish are a great food source, and very likely you're already making a dock to contest water, so it's a pretty natural decision. The tougher question though is what about on Black Forest? Now, you won't always have a nearby pond, so sometimes the choice is made for you, but even if you're lucky enough to have one, the fact we're talking about a land map means you have to go out of your way to make the dock. We're also talking about shore fish instead of deep sea fish, which collect much slower and hold less food. Plus, even on a single lake, the amount of fish can vary from just 1 or 2 shore fish up to 5 or more. Trying to balance all of these factors really muddies the water, and at what point does it start to make sense to invest in fishing, and what sort of payoff can you expect? I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I'll try my best to put it all together in a logical and helpful way. To start with, the obvious advantage of docking a lake is that you're adding a second economic production building in addition to your town center. Fishing ships aren't created quite as fast as villagers and take 40 seconds to build, but are still speeding up at least your population growth by around 60%. Keep in mind, fishing ships on shorefish collect around 10% slower than regular villagers on berries and sheep, even in a best-case scenario. In practice, it would probably be more reasonable to say a dock is expanding your economy up to 50 to 55% faster than usual in late Dark Age, when everything's considered. That's not an insignificant amount, but also not twice as fast as usual, so I wouldn't think of it as on the same level as a second town center. The downside is of course the extra wood investment, with docks costing 150 and fishing ships being 75 wood each. Compared to villagers, that doesn't immediately sound like a great deal, with fishing ships giving a similar or slightly worse gather rate to villagers while costing 50% more resources. Unlike villagers, which take roughly 2.5 minutes to pay for themselves, fishing ships are more like 4.5 to 5 minutes depending on the distance they're fishing to. That is improved with deep-sea fish, but I can't remember ever seeing deep-sea fish on the small lakes you find on Black Forest, Cenotes, or Yucatan, for example, though notably they do spawn on alpine lakes, which is a bit of an odd exception and makes fishing look actually a little better on that map. Practically speaking, with Black Forest in mind, going for fishing involves a pretty significant change to your early villager distribution. Normally, on a closed map, after an initial 6 on sheep and 4 on wood, you'll start sending the next wave of at least 5 or 6 villagers to food, at least if you're doing a typical fast castle. If you're trying to sneak in a dock in fishing ships though, you just won't have enough wood without some modification. Typically, you need at least a 5th on wood early, and actually 6 makes it quite a bit easier, though I wouldn't call myself an expert in Black Forest build orders, and that's just what seems to work for me. Technically, you would need 5 extra villagers on wood to sustain fishing ship production perpetually, but an idle dock here and there isn't the end of the world. Even just 3 or 4 fishing ships in Dark Age is enough to get the effect you're going for and add some extra population. And once you're advancing to feudal age with 10 or more on wood, it becomes much easier to sustain. Even with an early dock though, the first fishing ship you create is only breaking even on its initial wood cost right around the time you're clicking up to feudal, while any later ships you create will almost have to be putting you at a temporary resource deficit. This is where an element of vulnerability comes in, and if you aren't as safely walled as you thought you were, someone could potentially take advantage of your late uptime and temporary lack of resources. To make that a bit more concrete, let's take a look at an example. Suppose you have a fast castle build you like to do with a decent civilization where you go up to feudal age with 26 villagers without loom, and we'll say you execute it perfectly, so you're clicking up at just after 9.5 minutes. Now let's assume you have a lake and you build a dock with your 12th villager. Finishing that around 4.5 minutes means your first fishing ship isn't coming out until a little after the 5-minute mark. Converting the fishing ship and dock cost into villager time to gather those resources, and then tracking how much food the fishing ships are gathering, at the time you typically click up, you could have up to 7 fishing ships. At that point, you'd be down about 16 villager minutes worth of work, or a little over 300 resources. Down 300 resources, you can see why sustaining fishing ships is quite taxing on your economy at that point in time. On the other hand, if you stop at 4 fishing ships, you're only down 170. So with a strong civ bonus, you're arguably not hurt too bad with a bit of a fish boom. The complete payoff, assuming you dock fairly early, ends up being between 17 and 20 in-game minutes, depending on which point you stop making ships. Even with a lot of simplification, the payback time for a reasonable 4 or even an extreme number of fishing ships seems like it's early enough to supercharge your Castle Age boom. Another small effect that this doesn't account for is that villagers collect wood faster than food from farms. So by having fishing ships focus on a chunk of your food income and moving a few villagers from food to wood, it's actually playing more to the villager's strength as well. This is all painting a pretty rosy picture, but it wouldn't be a very good fishing video if there wasn't a catch. So far, the food income has all been free, but what happens when you run out of shorefish? It takes around 12 minutes for a single fishing ship to deplete a shorefish tile, but as you start to double them up, that can happen pretty quickly, and this is where the size of the pond factors in. On a pond with just 2 shorefish, creating even 3 fishing ships almost negates the food you'd be gathering, or with 3 shorefish, you're breaking even if you make 6 fishing ships. Any more than those numbers, and there isn't enough natural fish to pay back your investment unless you build fish traps. Yucatan, in contrast, usually only has 1 shorefish per lake, which doesn't even end up looking good with 1 fishing ship. Now, I've heard different rules around this, like making 1 or even 2 fishing ships per tile, and certainly any more than that, you'll go through the natural fish very quickly. Regardless of how many ships you make though, eventually you'll use up all of the natural food, and this is where we enter the second phase of the fishing ship question, and whether it's worth continuing to invest on water by creating fish traps. In the early game, they have a much better wood to food conversion than you can get from farms, meaning they can potentially save a lot of wood in the long run. They also give you something to do with your extra fishing ships, allowing you to salvage their cost as well. Again, there's a very similar theme as with fishing ships in general though, which is that they take a long time to pay off. Fish traps gather at roughly 21 food per minute, giving them just under a 5-minute payback, whereas a feudal age farm, in contrast, pays back about a minute and a half earlier. That's not to say that fish traps are bad, but that the recurring theme is that nothing about fishing ships on small lakes gives a quick payoff. That said, things actually start to look quite a bit more solid in the late game. With the Gillnets technology, fishing ships on fish traps actually collect a little faster than even perfectly placed farms. Once you throw in the decent wood efficiency of fish traps and the fact that we now have an automatic fish trap reseed in Definitive Edition, there's a pretty compelling argument. Really, the only major downside is that fishing ships can't garrison or even run away from a raid, which, depending on the location and exposure of the lake, could be something to consider. In fairness, they can also be more micro-intensive and finicky to set up than farms, as their placement really needs to be right against a dock, and they can get confused when you try to lay down a lot of traps at the same time. Also, since I brought it up, I think we should talk now about the tech Gillnets. It adds 25% to fishing ship collection rate while only costing 150 food and 200 wood. Though despite that cheap cost, it isn't necessarily the best idea to get if you only have a handful of fishing ships. For example, with only 4 of them, the tech would take 16 or 17 minutes to pay off. It's only when you get to 8 or 9 fishing ships that you bring that down to a more reasonable payoff time. Of course, it's not going to be worth it on lakes without fish traps, but if you start using fish traps as an augment for your farming, then it's absolutely worth getting. The argument for using late-game fish traps is even stronger for a couple of civilizations as well. For the Malay, their fish traps are not only cheaper, but also give 3 times as much food, which works out to 32 food for every 1 wood spent. That means the soonest you would ever have to replace one is over an hour and 22 minutes after it's built. Another very strong bonus is for the Japanese, whose fishing ships gather progressively faster throughout the game. Early on, the extra 5 or 10% makes them more comparable to villagers gathering from farms, and the plus 20% collection in the late game is a great incentive for fish traps. Another civ that comes to mind is of course the Italians, with 15% cheaper fishing ships. That only works out to 11 wood per ship, but on a big enough fish boom, that can definitely add up. Now, just to steer things in a completely different direction before we wrap up, what about just bypassing the dock entirely and instead building a mill? This is particularly tempting if your shore fish are close together, and given the large upfront cost of the dock and fishing ships putting you behind until mid-feudal age or even castle, this is an alternative to get an extra food boost without all of that investment. Villagers collect very quickly from shore fish, much faster than fishing ships for example, and doing this can even delay having to place farms. I don't see it being done all that often on Black Forest, but if you have 2 shore fish right beside each other, it is something to consider. You can always dock later if you like the idea of fish traps and their long-term wood efficiency. Also, as a side note, if you play the Definitive Edition, villagers can now collect fish and drop them off at a dock, meaning even without a mill, a villager can still get in on the action. So to put my thoughts together, overall I was pleasantly surprised with how good fishing on lakes appears to be. It definitely sets you behind temporarily, but if you're safely behind walls, that window shouldn't be long enough for an opponent to really take advantage of. In addition to the free early food and faster economic expansion, fish traps with gillnets are better than farmers without crop rotation from a wood efficiency standpoint, and even from a collection rate perspective. The only caveat I'd put on fish traps is if you're running out of shore fish just as you reach castle age, I would hold off on building them until you have your extra town centers. Villagers have a much faster payback time, and the real fishing trap would be to neglect your villager production in an effort to keep your fishing ships busy. A bit of idle time for your fishing ships is fine if it means getting your town centers up. That's all for this one though. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.